This lecture will focus on what life was like during the Civil War. The economies of both the North and the South were struggling at the very beginning of the war and struggled to kind of get themselves going and figure themselves out with all of the men leaving their jobs, leaving their farms and everything like that to go and fight in the war. It became an issue, right? A lot of people are going there to stop their jobs, fight, and potentially die and never come back to their jobs. And so the economies both struggled a little bit, but the North quickly was able to turn it around, whereas the South kind of just continued to get worse and worse and worse. Some of the problems in the South were that they had, they were lacking a lot of things. So if we look at this up here, we see that the North had most of everything. They had most of the people, most of the railroad miles, most of the iron and steel, most of the money, most of the exports, so money they're making from sending off stuff, and way most of the factories. I mean, 85%, that's incredible. And all that the South really had were these large farms. But again, that's kind of deceiving because while they should be able to feed their people, really, what were they farming? They were farming cash crops like cotton and tobacco, which is not too good to eat. All right, and so that caused some severe food shortages, and the severe food shortages were caused by this transportation system that was collapsing. There was a blockade from the sea, which means that none of the ships could get in or ships could get out, and of course, most of the railroads were up in the north too, and so that was hurting them because they were losing access to all of that. And even as the war started, and we've already talked about, the North really focused on taking control of the railways of the South, the major ones, and cutting them off from the rest of the world. The Union also sent their troops to the important farming regions of the South and were in there fighting. And so it was difficult to move the farmed goods around to help out the soldiers and help out the people of the South. And so it got just horrible, horrible, horrible in the winter of 1862 to 1863. And all of these problems that were happening, the soldiers heard about their families struggling and not able to eat and starving to death and things like that, and they deserted and went back to their farms, and people were angry and rioted in the towns. They ran into the towns screaming bread, 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 and into the capital of Richmond, and broke into the shops and were stealing the food and clothes and shoes and other goods that they needed. All right, because those things were for sale, but there weren't very many of them, so the inflation had them way too expensive for anybody to be able to afford. In the North, however, there was an economic boom because after that first downturn, the factories got churning, and those factories and industries allowed them to make plenty of goods for the people and for the military. They made plenty of uniforms, weapons, and ammo, and tools, and other things that the military needed. And they were also cranking out this technology like Cyrus McCormick's Reaper and big mowers and things like that, which made it easier for a smaller amount of people to run a farm. You just didn't need as many people, and so it was able to be done. The farms kept running even though the men were out fighting, because oftentimes the women would be at home and they would continue to make the farm go on. And the women took the place of the men not only on the farm but also in many of the factories. They jumped in and started to do some of these things during this particular war. Conscription in the North was happening also at this time. It got to the point where even the North did not have enough troops to continue on with their increased population, and so they needed to use conscription and draft some people in also. And so they had eligible for the draft all men that were 20 to 45 years old, so a big span of anywhere from 20 to 45, and you could be called up into the draft. Now, there were ways around it. You could find somebody who would take on your spot as a replacement, and then you would not be eligible for the draft, or you could pay a $300 fee, and then you would not be eligible to the draft. So really, the Civil War kind of became a poor man's war because the people that were conscribed could, you remember, in the South, if you were a big plantation owner, you didn't have to go because you had 20 or more slaves. You didn't have to do it. In the North, if you had $300 to spare, then you also didn't have to go and fight. So it became a war where poor people were fighting poor people from the two areas. And obviously, there was some frustration. There always is with drafts. People that don't want to fight being forced to fight is not a good thing. And so it caused many riots across the North, and the kind of the most infamous one would happen in New York City. With the Emancipation Proclamation that we talked about before in the last set of notes, African Americans were now allowed to join the military, and so thousands rushed to join this battle. Remember, this battle is for their freedom. This battle is for the freedom of African Americans in the country, among other things. And so thousands rushed to join quickly. And what they thought is if they fought alongside the other men, the white men, then it would help them to overcome this racial prejudice. They would see them as the people that they are, and not so much as a completely separate, different thing. About all in all, about 180,000 African Americans served in the Army during the Civil War, about 10% of all the soldiers, and about 18,000 served in the Navy. So, it was close to 200,000 total African American combatants in the military on the North Side during the Civil War. One of the first African American regiments was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. It's a picture of them, or some of them, right here. Okay, and so this 54th Massachusetts Infantry was sent to Fort Wagner, which was a battle that happened in the Carolinas, and they fought extremely bravely. They ran in at the beginning of the battle, and they just kept on going. Almost half were killed or wounded during it, but they did their job. They fought bravely. They made it to the destiny. They did what they needed to do within that battle. And so this was absolutely very important. I don't know if these men in the 54th Massachusetts understood how important it was, but it was so important for the future of that war and the future of African American soldiers for a long time, because if these were the very first ones that were allowed to fight in this conflict, and if they showed that they were scared or ran away or anything like that, then all African American would be judged, or men would be judged on these men in the 54th Massachusetts. So they knew that they had to fight bravely to prove that other African Americans could also be good soldiers, and to allow them, or, for Americans to allow them to fight with them. And so they did that and kind of paved the way for those 200,000 other African Americans who would fight in that war. And maybe those other men don't even ever fight in that war if these men decide to retreat quickly or something like that. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint 1. The soldier's life was difficult, as it kind of always is, and it's never up to the standard of the rest of the people in the country's life. They had some hardships, and they weren't really ready for them at the beginning. There's just a few anecdotes, like Union General Irvin McDowell. His troops stopped to pick some berries to eat, and they used the water in their canteens to wash off the berries, which is not such a big deal when you have plentiful supplies of water. But if you're in a battle and you need that water later on, and you wasted it to wash your berries, that's not such a good thing. And also, they weren't used to these long journeys where they're walking on their feet, and these huge marches. And so it kind of started to become a reality, and they started to figure it out. Now, especially in the South, these soldiers were missing just essential things like shoes that you need to wear on your feet, or blankets to keep yourself warm. Especially the men in the South needed these things because there were no factories churning them out like there was in the North. The food was also an issue. Food was, for the North, a lot of times they ate just hardtack, and hardtack is essentially like this real hard cracker made out of wheat flour and water is basically it. And it's just this cracker. Sometimes they would throw some pork in there to give it some flavor, but otherwise, that's a lot of what you're eating. And in the South, they would have the same type of thing, but it was made out of corn. Cornbread is what they were eating mostly as they're moving along in the South. And really, they only got the supplement with fruit and vegetables and the things that you need for your body to function well. You only got that when you could take it from farms as you were passing them by. Um, and so, that was a little bit of an issue. Battlefield medicine was another issue. Medicine wasn't that advanced, and so they had a lot of different problems. First off, there's a ton of people being killed, injured, horribly injured in many terms, in many ways, and there were just too many of them to tend to for the doctors, and so they were really struggling just to be able to help out the people that were injured. And at that point, they didn't really understand very well infection, the idea of infection, and germs. Like they knew infection happened, but they didn't know how it spread and what the germs were doing. And so they would use the exact same unsterilized tools on many patients in a row, and they would spread that infection and these germs from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And it got to the point where it was pretty common that these men had to amputate, these doctors had to amputate or cut off limbs, arms, legs, feet, whatever, to keep the infection from spreading, okay, to keep that infection from spreading around to other parts of the body and killing them, killing the troops. This was a huge problem. Also, another huge problem was disease. They're crowded together in these camps with unsanitary water sources where who knows what's going on in that water. You don't have the ability to filter it or anything like that. And so that can make you sick. And then you have smallpox ravaging through your camp where everyone's close together. And it was just kind of a really difficult time to be a doctor in the military, especially. And so what women did during the war, mostly they kind of took over for the men. They were managing the family farms, managing the businesses, as we talked about before. But also they started to jump into the battles, not to fight, but to serve as nurses for the wounded. So they would go to the military hospitals and camps and stuff like that and try and help out people that were wounded. Elizabeth Blackwell, we talked about her before, as the first female physician doctor in America. She created a training program, the very first one for nurses, to help them be better, and eventually morphed into the United States Sanitary Commission. The United States Sanitary Commission would provide medical help as well as supplies to army camps and hospitals. So it was basically this group of people who went from camp to camp and hospital to hospital to help out where there was the most need, giving them nurses as well as supplies that they badly needed. And so many women at this time joined the United States Sanitary Commission and volunteered to either help out themselves or to help raise money to get supplies for these suffering men. Clara Barton also is kind of a really famous nurse at this time. She had a great job, an amazing job in the patent office, and she left that job. She saw the need out there for nurses, and she left that job to go out and nurse soldiers on the battlefield. And so she was kind of seen as a hero for doing that. And so this overall changed nursing, the idea of nursing in the United States forever, became kind of a women-dominated profession, and it just changed how it worked. And it showed that women were not weaker than men in many cases, and they could do a lot of the same jobs. Another problem would be what would happen if you were taken prisoner by the other side, and that's something that the men had to deal with. And so, at first, there were prisoner exchanges. At the beginning of the war, they were pretty common to exchange North's prisoners for South's prisoners. And so that's kind of how it worked. And generally, if you were a prisoner, you got released or whatever to the other side. You were put on probation. You were not allowed to go back and join the fight. Okay, so this was common at the beginning of the war, but then the Emancipation Proclamation came along, and the slaves, or the South said, you know what, we're not going to stand for this. You can't tell us not to have our slaves. And so they said if they were to get any African American prisoners, then they would either re-enslave them, put them back in as slaves, or execute them on the spot. And so Lincoln said, you know what, fine, if you want to be the tough about it, and you guys are the ones that have less people, so you need the prisoner exchanges a lot more than us. Okay, we're just going to stop all prisoner exchanges, and so that's what they did. And so the populations of the prisons got bigger, and it was really difficult to take care of the prisoners because you were already taking care of your own people, and you were taking care of your soldiers, and your soldiers were not working to make the food and supplies that you needed, and so it was really difficult, especially in the South where they didn't have the factories to be able to mass produce the things that they needed. One of the most difficult prisons, and definitely the most infamous prison in the Civil War, was in Andersonville, Georgia. And this is a painting kind of showing it. And so this was essentially a big open field with no shade or shelter. You just had to create shelter out of whatever you brought with you when you were caught. So if you had blankets or you could find sticks or something like that, then you could make a shelter. Otherwise, you were kind of stuck. And you were stuck there, and there was a big 15-foot fence around, and there were guards all over, and then there was an interior fence, which was very small, and you could easily go by it, but it was called the deadline, and it was called the deadline for a reason, because if you crossed it, you would be dead. The soldiers would shoot and kill you. And so it was not a great, it was not a great place to be, and these people were stuck out there with no shade or shelter in the winters, in the summers, in all of these different things. And so out of about 45,000 of the prisoners, 13,000 of them died from exposure to the elements, so over either too much cold, too much heat, whatever, starvation, and disease. And there was a summer in 1864 in August when things dried up, and it was very hot, and it was more than 100 people were dying per day in that summer of 1864. The commander right here, Henry Wurz, he was the commandant of Andersonville Prison. He was in charge of it, and he was the only person who, after the Civil War, was executed for war crimes. Okay, so he was the only one that did something so evil that they tried him for war crimes and executed him. Take a few minutes to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test questions that you might see on the quiz or the test from this material.